work. Uh, and then my co-presenters, Vivian Sierra and Dr. Rush Wilson, will follow up with a little bit about more of kind of the clinical concerns relevant to the populations with which we work, and moreover, ways in which you can perhaps help. So I'll jump right into it in the interest of time, and I'll try to sort of very gingerly gesture to you, Dr. Rush Wilson, to advance a slide each time that's needed. So if you will advance now, that'd be great.
Sure.
Hi, everyone. I'm Vivian Sierra. My pronouns are they, them, and I'm a licensed professional counselor in the state of Illinois, as well as a second-year doctoral student here at the Chicago School. My interest in working with LGBTQ refugees stems from over 15 years of community-based experience and my clinical work, which led me to really wanting to advocate for this unique population and some of the unique challenges that face them. So I do want to give a content warning for the slides that I will be presenting on. They will be a little bit heavy and they will deal with some violence.
And I'm Tiffany Rush Wilson. I am the program chair here for this department at the Chicago School. And I also am a person in clinical practice. My interest in this topic came in part largely from knowing Enloe Wilson and the work that he does, and also having chosen to immigrate between countries and knowing what that experience was like when you choose to do it, and considering what it might be like for people who are in a very different position and how many difficulties are associated with that transition.
Great, thanks for that. And I'm sorry that I sort of preempted the two of you in your introductions with my overzealous attempt to kind of jump right into the content, but now we can. So Rainbow Railroad, as I mentioned, we've been in operation since 2006. We basically facilitate the safe passage of at-risk. I'm going to use the term queer here. I'm going to use the term as a sort of reappropriated term that was intended originally as a derogatory way of referring to members of the LGBTQ plus population. We essentially have reclaimed it. We've reclaimed it proudly, use it proudly as a sort of cultural shorthand to refer to the entirety of the community. You'll hear me use it throughout my presentation, but I wanted to set some context as to the whys and hows I use that term. If we move on to the next slide, though, we can jump into the context for our work. So right now, according to the UN, there are some 114 million displaced persons around the world. And these could be persons forcibly pushed out of where they live, essentially, for a number of reasons. This could be due to persecution, military conflict, violence, human rights concerns. But 114 million people is the current total. That's a moving number, a moving target, obviously, as conflicts come and go, that number shifts. But I will say that it is the highest number of displaced persons ever on record. So to the 114 million people, actually, I won't add to that, but I will say within that 114 million people, some estimated 30 million people are unidentified, forcibly displaced. So these would be folks forced out of their comfortable homes for any of the reasons that I just mentioned, but for whatever reason, not sort of identifying as a displaced person. And this could be for a number of reasons. We deal with a number of, and I say we, but our organization, but all organizations dealing with displaced persons deal with a number who, for whatever reason, don't want to identify. And these could be members of the queer community. These could be women, for example, who are escaping domestic violence and other sort of related experiences, and find it downright sort of detrimental or perhaps threatening to identify themselves for whatever reason. But obviously, that's a number that we want to be aware of because it sort of sets the overall context for our work. And in addition, 50 million internally displaced persons. So these would be people who are displaced not necessarily out of their country of residence, but outside of their municipality or local region of residence. So some folks, for example, need to flee violence from their home, but they don't need to leave Afghanistan. They just need to reside safely in another region of that country. But I give these numbers just to offer the sort of overarching and quite large and daunting context of the resettlement work that we do. And if we could advance, that'd be great. So people find themselves displaced for any number of reasons. I mentioned a few: military conflict, domestic violence, what have you. What we find is that increasingly other factors play into that as well. And some of these factors could be economic insecurity, um, yeah, thank you, climate change, global pandemics, what have you. And as you might imagine, that for certain sections of the population that find themselves displaced, there are additional and specific concerns relevant to those communities with which they identify. This is the case with the queer community. So on top of all of these other reasons that folks might find themselves pushed out of their homes and needing to move by force or unwillingly, right? They have to do this as a matter of survival. The queer community, of course, deals with a certain antipathy that we see across the world towards the queer community. And that antipathy plays out both in law and pieces of legislation that are tabled around the world. And last year, we saw a record number of pieces of such legislation that seek to curtail the rights and mobility and visibility of the queer community, and particularly the trans community. But then we also see outside of the laws a certain social antipathy. And I'll talk a little bit about regions around the world, and Vivian will do so as well in greater detail. But what we see is that those regions of the world, particularly that have dealt with decades or centuries of colonialism and theological sort of frameworks, social frameworks, legal frameworks that had been imposed upon them under colonialist rule, as they find themselves in periods or eras of independence, they also find themselves struggling and being challenged to kind of define what their own take on human sexuality and gender expression and family and society happens to be. And in that sort of tumultuousness, the queer community is always sort of the canary in the coal mine, right? Where there are places of discomfort with these conversations. An easy target always has been the queer community. That's the case now. And in that context, many displaced persons who happen also to be queer just find that as one additional trauma of the entire experience. If we could progress. So right now, the global landscape is such that 69 countries in the world right now criminalize intimate relationships, sexual relationships between persons of the same sex and or non-cisgender expressions. I often go into presentations like this with the assumption that folks know what I mean when I refer to cisgender people. Very quickly, cisgender refers to kind of gender expressions that are opposite the gender to which a person was assigned at birth. So you were born, doctor looks at the plumbing, the doctor assigns you a gender. If you are cisgender, however, you come to realize throughout your life that the gender with which you identify and the gender that you kind of know yourself to be does not always align to kind of your physicality, right? And cis, meaning sort of across from Latin, is how those persons refer to themselves. So 69 countries criminalize that sort of gender expression alongside same-sex intimacy. And of those 69 countries, 11 actually will criminalize those activities with death. Next slide. So I already mentioned Rainbow Railroad. Given the context that I set, we are an organization that basically just, in the broadest sense possible, tries to facilitate the safety of queer persons who live under those environments. Next slide. So since actually this is incorrect, and I'll take responsibility for that. Since 2006, we've assisted over 16,000 individuals who reached out for help through a suite of programming up to and including emergency travel assistance. But on the next slide, I believe it is. If we progress to the next slide. Go back one. Right. In addition to the emergency travel assistance, we have a suite of programming. So what's interesting about Rainbow Railroad is that since 2006, we had done only emergency travel support, had done it quite well, and had become known and celebrated for that work. We were challenged during COVID in that suddenly you have a situation where folks continue to reach out for help, but you cannot resettle them amid travel restrictions. We had to pivot a bit, become quite creative, and we had to introduce what has now become a suite of programs to supplement that travel support. So program number one would be direct livelihood assistance. Sometimes folks don't need to be shuttled across the planet. What they in fact need is a little bit of cash support to kind of help them find safe housing where they have perhaps been kicked out of their own home or kicked out of their own community or what have you. And through program one, we can afford that assistance. We also do partnership development under our program two. So we work with any number, hundreds, literally hundreds of organizations around the world who do direct service provision locally. These would be safe house providers. These would be upstart legal clinics or law practices that represent queer persons. We want them to thrive. They often operate in areas of the world where they don't have the wherewithal or the connectivity to do the work that they want to do. But we see the necessity in having them survive, and through a grant program, Rainbow Railroad can often offer them assistance. We do emergency responses. So in the routine work that we do, our interventions and our advocacy work, often there are hotspots that just pop up around the world. I'll talk a little bit about this in greater detail later, but many of you might be familiar with legislation recently out of places like Uganda or Ghana. Certainly you would know about the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, or of Ukraine, excuse me. And in scenarios like that, and sudden kind of surges in requests for help out of areas like that, we need to be quite nimble, quite agile, and very quickly intervene to sometimes remove people as immediately as possible because their lives are threatened. And our emergency response program offers that agility. We also have non-monetary support and networking programming, wherein, in addition to sort of affording monetary supports, we send names, email addresses, physical addresses of people and support workers in regions of the world where people need them, where they simply might not know about them. And as you might guess, it behooves a number of actors across the world to operate in some degree of secrecy, right? So on the one hand, you're wanting to reach those communities that you're there for, but on the other hand, you can't do it, or you have to do it in a very clandestine way. And how do people find out about you? And one of the ways we hope is that through the non-monetary support and networking provision, those names can get out there. And finally, this is our newest program. We do private sponsorships of refugees. So in administrations that are, shall I say, not particularly sympathetic to the resettlement of refugee claimants, and certainly not queer ones, and certainly not queer refugee claimants of color, which happens to be a population with which we work quite heavily. What we find is that we can't rely necessarily on government-assisted resettlements. We have to rely increasingly on private citizens who will sponsor refugee claimants to resettle to safer parts of the world. So increasingly, a good portion of our resources, time, attention are given to kind of making sure those cells of private refugee sponsors are identified and supported and can survive. Next slide. So I'm going to give a little bit of a survey of the world and kind of the legal and social context in which we work. Vivian will talk in greater detail later around concerns that are, on the one hand, universal across the queer community, but on the other hand, very, very specific to the region in which they, from which they come. We have the assumption, and it's interesting, this is the first queer organization, I'll say that, for which I worked. But I arrived at this organization as a man who identifies as gay, working suddenly in concert with lesbians and trans-identified people and folks who identify all across the LGBTQI plus spectrum. One of the assumptions that we have is that we all have the same concerns and the same experiences and the same outcomes, and it's absolutely not true. Much of what we experience and much of how we navigate that is dependent upon where we're raised. And so I think Vivian's presentation will give light to that. But in terms of just a brief overview, if we look at various regions of the world, let's advance to the next slide here. So the Caribbean is interesting in that it is a perennial hotspot for help requests. And it sort of illustrates a pattern that we see elsewhere in the world. I mentioned these regions coming out of centuries of colonial rule and thereby legal, social, religious influences long imposed upon them. And the Caribbean is just such a region. So here we have a number of countries that within the last 100 years, and many of them sort of far more recently than that, have suddenly found themselves declaring independence and wrestling with what their own sort of legal systems and social mores look like with respect to gender, sexuality, humanity, and that sort of thing. I will use and what I will say is in that struggle, many of these places tend to exemplify some of the most conservative and strictest parameters around family and sexuality and gender. And it's sort of a protective posture, completely understand it. One of the countries that I'll just call out is Jamaica. So Jamaica is perennially among the top 5 countries in the world from which we receive help requests. And so what we find in Jamaica is that in addition to the sort of legal system criminalizing same-sex relations, that in itself is dangerous, right? It subjects Jamaican citizens to all sorts of scrutiny and crackdowns and that sort of thing. But the real danger of a scenario like that is that those sorts of laws, that sort of legislation normalizes an antipathy toward the queer community. So in addition to the laws that we fight and the laws from which folks seek to flee, they're also seeking to flee an incredibly homophobic, and I don't mean to speak I don't mean to characterize the whole of Jamaica. Obviously, there are exceptions in the citizens there, in the areas of the country in which they live, and that sort of thing. But in broadest strokes, what I can say is that we have seen a pattern of rampant homophobia and transphobia across the country, such that folks need to flee. And not all of this is legal. Much of this is social. There is a community in East Kingston called the McGregor Fully community. And in 2009, that community initiated or introduced what they refer to as their Gay Eradication Day. This was not at all a legal holiday. This wasn't something promulgated from the halls of government. A group of private citizens decided that on Gay Eradication Day, they were going to corral themselves and they were going to purge the gay members of their community, whom they believed to be subjecting the greater Jamaican society to things like earthquakes. And I mean, we've heard it all before, that sort of thing. They did this in 2009. It has returned intermittently to Jamaica as is kind of the celebrated day to basically bash the queer community. And so this is just suggestive of the fact that it's not just the laws, but the sort of regional cultures that we battle. If we could progress to the next slide. So South America is an interesting continent in that the entirety of that continent is a bit of a paradox for us. So on the one hand, Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, they all passed same-sex marriage laws prior to 2013, which made them among the first 15 countries in the entire world to do so. Also in January 2018, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights ruled that under the American Convention on Human Rights, to sort of be governed or bound under that convention, a member country must protect same-sex marriage and the right to legally identify under the gender of choice. And what that ruling did was effectively decriminalize queerness across the continent. Since then, however, only Ecuador and Costa Rica have passed laws explicitly affording the right of same-sex marriage to their citizens. And elsewhere, we continue to receive reports from LGBTQ people that they are presented with extraordinary challenges in accessing the rights that are afforded to their opposite sex peers in domestic situations. So these would include property transfer rights, adoptions and guardianships of children, that sort of thing. So again, it's not just the laws that we fight, it's the sort of social antipathy toward the queer community that we fight. If we progress to the next slide. So Africa, again, is a challenging place for us. Of the countries I mentioned earlier, the 69 that outlaw same-sex intimacy and or non-cisgender expression, a good half of those countries happen to be in Africa. And some of you might be aware of the Anti-Homosexuality Act of 2023 in Uganda that passed over the past year. So among other things, that piece of legislation, in its original version, it subjected repeated same-sex intimacy to the death penalty. It compelled citizens to turn in suspected members of the queer community, even subjected landlords in one draft of the law to criminality if their properties were used as venues for homosexual activity. The good news is that some of those provisions were challenged in the past year successfully in court and struck down. However, the overall sort of law still does stand as one of the most sort of forwardly, I'd say, anti-queer and far-reaching laws across the continent of Africa. And we have seen a 49% increase of help requests come out of Uganda since the tabling of that law last spring. The other danger of a law like that is that there's a bit of a domino effect, obviously. As feared, we are starting to see similar pieces of legislation humored in nearby countries. Right now, for example, Ghana is considering legislation that would basically enforce some of the provisions of the original versions of that Ugandan law, and even criminalize the mere public identification as a member of the queer community. And this is something of which we were particularly afraid and something that we continue to monitor. Uganda and Ghana have long been celebrated as fairly progressive countries out of the continent of Africa, fairly stable countries. And if they could fall under this sort of thinking and legislation, we fear about the balance of the country, right? All that said, there are some heartening developments coming out of Africa. South Africa last year, for example, was the first African country to legalize same-sex marriage. Angola recently signed into law, provisions banning discrimination along the lines of sexual orientation. And Botswana, I have notes here. Botswana, Gabon, Lesotho, Mozambique, and Seychelles have recently decriminalized same-sex relations. So there's always a sort of ebb and flow, this tug of war around attitudes toward the queer community. We continue to monitor that continent very closely. A lot of requests we receive come out of Africa, and it's an incredibly important kind of area of the world to keep an eye on relative to sort of queer concerns. Next slide, and I'll zip through these next few regions. So although same-sex couples are legal and same-sex intimacy legal in Russia, under the Putin regimes, and this is both his modern regime, his sort of current regime, and his earlier regime from I think it was 99 through 2008, we saw repeated pieces of legislation that very strategically targeted media depictions of the queer community. Initially, these were pieces of media to which children would have access, and the contention was that by seeing the queer community and certain activities, certain gender expressions in media, you're kind of poisoning the minds of the Russian youth, right? Increasingly, and under his current administration, we see such laws being tabled that would subject all media, so media to which even adults have access, under the same vein of sort of logic, if you will. So here we have again these laws on the one hand that don't criminalize your being a member of the queer community, but criminalize your mobility and your visibility, and therefore sort of scaffold an antipathy toward the queer community in Russia. We have received increased calls for help out of Russia. And by extension, out of places sort of adjacent to Russia, former Soviet bloc countries, certainly Ukraine, but also places like Belarus and Georgia and et cetera. Next slide. So the Middle East, much like regions that have lived under very conservative expressions of Roman Catholicism, like South America, for example, we see similar patterns of activity throughout the Muslim world. Afghanistan and Pakistan have been consistently among the top regions of the world from where we receive our help requests, with requests received specifically out of Afghanistan having skyrocketed in the past few years. So in May of 2021, the Taliban seized control over Afghanistan after the U.S. and allied forces sort of left that country. And instilled a very, very strict, perhaps the strictest expression of Sharia law that we've seen anywhere in the world. Now, many populations, many communities are subject to these very strict laws, women, for example. But obviously the queer community as well would be particularly vulnerable. Just by way of quotes, there was a judge who interviewed for a German newspaper Bild in July 2021. And his quote sort of summarizes anything that I could possibly say about the danger coming out of Afghanistan for queer people. And he said, "We have two punishments for homosexuals, either stoning or they have to stand behind a wall that will fall on their heads. The wall should be 2.5 to 3 meters high. And this is a method of punishment that the Taliban used when they were in power initially in 1996 to 2001. So this, again, is this sort of thinking we see across parts of the Muslim world that have more conservative expressions of Sharia law. And if we progress to the next slide. So by extension of that as well, such as the case in the Asian Pacific, where, for example, consensual same-sex activity is punishable by up to 10 years in prison. So that just gives a general kind of lay of the land of the context, the geopolitical context in which we work. I'll stop there. Vivian's going to pick up a little bit with about more specific issues of concern from a clinical angle to persons from those places of the world. Oh, actually, you know what? I won't stop there. I have a couple. So as of 2023, I forgot about this, but this is important. One of the things that struck us at Rainbow Railroad is that we are one of the few organizations in the world that do exactly what we do in service to the exact populations with which we work. So that is to say, no one else in the world seems to be capturing data about queer refugee claimants and resettlements, and moreover, the very specific issues that they contend with before, during, and after resettlements, because it's all a traumatizing trajectory. We decided to capture some of the concerns that we call them case individuals, which I quite hate that terminology, but we decided to capture some of the concerns that our case individuals cite to us in their experiences. And among the top 5 are the ones that you see here with respect to health and welfare. Mental health concerns expressed by 42% of our CIs, lack of basic needs, 30%, suicide, employment discrimination, homelessness. And what I will say is these are the numbers captured across the entire community of CIs with whom we work. As a matter of course, I would suggest that for the trans community, you want to crank these numbers up by about 5% for each of those, which just goes to show that, they specifically deal with issues that the overall queer community deal with, but it's that much worse for them. And I would suggest that it's that much worse for them, not only because I think the broader sort of population or community often doesn't know how to just deal with trans people and the issues with which the issues that they face, but oftentimes the queer community can be quite transphobic. Some of the most viciously and forwardly transphobic things that I've heard have come out of the mouths of gay men, cis gay men, and it pans out into these sorts of concerns dealt with by the queer community. But then in addition to health and welfare, on the next slide, if we'll advance, we also track sort of more practical safety concerns. And among those concerns, these that you see here are among the top 5 that we see expressed by our community. And again, for the trans community, you want to crank those numbers up by about 5%. So I'm going to stop there, and Vivian will give a little bit more detail about the concerns faced by the queer community as they resettle.
Thanks, Enloe. So taking into account the regional differences, there are specific areas that impact LGBTQIA+ refugees from accessing mental health care. Prior experiences of severe trauma often leave refugees hesitant to reach out for help. These asylum seekers often have difficulty obtaining rights and citizenship due to laws that make proving need ambiguous. This is in part due to challenges around the definition of identity being Eurocentric and binary. This can often place LGBTQIA people at greater risk of furthering experiences of trauma or further experiences of trauma and exploitation. Next slide, please. Before we hone in on those unique areas, though, it's first important to understand the regional differences that force those who are LGBTQIA+ to seek refuge. And so I'm going to do these very briefly, and it's going to overlap a little bit with what Enloe talked about earlier, but it is important to kind of understand these differences. So in the Middle East and Northern Africa, sex between men is illegal in 10 out of the 18 countries of this region, where in 6 of those 10, the punishment is death. This region is also seeing a significant amount of displacement due to political unrest, which further creates barriers of access. In Africa, 35 countries criminalize being LGBTQIA+, with many bordering one another, making fleeing to neighboring countries just as dangerous. In Eastern Europe, as countries like Russia, Poland, and Hungary have become more conservative, there has been an increase in laws restricting LGBTQIA+ rights, as Enloe was talking about earlier with the media in particular and what children see, as well as this increases violence towards LGBTQIA+ individuals. In South and Central Asia, 21 of the 49 states outlaw same-sex intimacy, with only 9 of those providing laws against discrimination. In the Caribbean, 11 countries still criminalize same-sex intimacy, with violence common, and we see this in a number of countries there. In Central and South America, there is a crisis of migration and displacement as many seek asylum in the United States through Mexico. Of note is that since 2015, 5.3 million refugees have fled from Venezuela, leading many LGBTQIA+ Venezuelans to seek dangerous pathways to less restrictive neighboring countries that often leads to further experiences of violence. While many of these regional differences sound similar, it is important to remember that seeking refuge is highly contextually driven and subjective. Next slide, please. Keeping these regional differences in mind, prior experiences of severe prolonged trauma are common. These can include psychological abuse, physical abuse, and assault, including lashings, burnings, stonings, and other forms of torture, sexual abuse and assault, including corrective rape, forced conversion therapy, blackmail, public shaming and outings, as well as exposure to war and political instability. Next slide, please. At present, there are 1.3 million LGBTQIA+ immigrants who live in the United States. Of that 1.3 million, it is unclear how many are refugees. Given the rise in anti-LGBTQIA+ laws being introduced at alarming rates in the US, there are unique challenges to continuing to protect LGBTQIA+ refugees as these laws are put into practice. This includes increased violence and increased difficulty. Furthermore, the Dublin regulation, which governs the European Union, requires that the first country within the EU that a refugee is identified, so this would be fingerprints and photo identification, is the country that they must seek asylum. So an example of this is that a refugee may come to Hungary, for instance, and that is the first place they are identified as a refugee, but they then move to the Netherlands seeking a better life and more acceptance. The Netherlands will then send them back to Hungary, who will then potentially send them back to their country of origin, where they may face things like death. This is of particular concern right now because there seems to be a trend towards more conservative views in Europe and the US, and this definitely impacts LGBTQIA+ refugees and their ability to seek asylum. Next slide, please. This gets further complicated when under law for asylum seekers, their LGBTQIA+ identity must be proven. And what I mean by this is they must prove without a doubt that they are a gay man or a transgender individual, or for someone who is bisexual, this becomes even more complicated because this is again a very Eurocentric binary notion of what gender and sexuality look like. This has led to increased surveillance of refugees' phones and social media in many countries. And this mistrust of a refugee's LGBTQIA plus identity can lead to individuals not trusting mental health providers as they see them as extensions of that surveillance. Next slide, please. In many instances, LGBTQIA plus refugees experience further instances of trauma, which can look like the lack of safety to live authentically due to racism or other isms which intersect with an individual's whole identity. So this isn't just related to gender and sexuality, it's someone's whole identity, and it's important to take an intersectional view of that. Discrimination from their home country's refugees within the host country can mimic the same violence as their home country. Due to these factors, many are further oppressed by members of the LGBTQIA plus community in the home country, as Enloe was mentioning. Some of the most problematic statements about trans people or refugees can often come from within the LGBTQIA plus community. As such, many LGBTQIA plus refugees may turn to sex work as a means of survival, or may be in power dynamics with someone in the host country that are being exploited because of their vulnerable status. So in summary, the barriers to accessing mental health come from a range of contexts which prevent someone who is an LGBTQIA plus refugee from accessing care. Many of these include laws and oppressive Eurocentric norms, which further perpetuate violence against these refugees. Next slide.
So very briefly, I want to make sure we talk about the mental health concerns that impact the queer community. They are the mental health concerns that impact anyone. However, depression exists at a greater prevalence than in the general population, as does anxiety. There's a suicide risk, not because this person has faulty genetics. It's because this person might be exposed to things such as internalized homophobia or transphobia, bullying, rejection, lack of support, being hated by the community around you, which can lead to depression and ultimately may lead to suicide risk. Substance use disorders may also be related to a need to cope with societal pressures, with inter and intrapersonal issues as well. There's also minority stress. When you are identified as other and being marginalized, it can take a toll on one's mental health, obviously, and then stress related to trauma and to victimization. The quote, trauma denied is trauma transferred is particularly relevant here. So addressing the trauma that people experience is important. And then finally, it's important for clinicians to be aware when working with people who have been forced to immigrate that this trip is not a vacation-like experience. There are identity issues involved. There are cultural adjustments that have to be made for this person, not just because they're immigrating, but for the reasons that they've been forced to migrate from one place to another. The trauma and loss might be based on their prominent feelings and emotions and expressed strongly when you interact and meet with them. This person may need to rebuild their coping skills. They may need to develop an amount of resilience to cope with the trauma and the tragedy of what has happened in their lives. And this person may need validation and active listening and affirmations from someone who's working with them in a clinical setting. Further, when working with people, it's important to express kindness and have a willingness to extend compassion to them, help to create safe spaces for people, help to provide supports, which can be basic supports, it seems to some, things like offering someone a ride or information about a job in the area or information about religious affiliations, healthcare information, things that this person will need to understand adjusting from one culture, one society to another. They may need emotional supports and friendship. They might need advocacy. They might need awareness to what the community they have joined has to offer and where to be careful. They may need support for coping with stigma and discrimination, as well as housing and educational supports broadly. Then more specifically,
So I'll jump in right here. There are three ways that you can certainly help this work, and specific to the work done by Rainbow Railroad. The first of which is make yourself available as a community of care ally. So I mentioned earlier this Welcome Corps program, federal Biden-Harris administration program seeking to identify and support cells of 5 private citizens. And they could be friends, they could be faith group members, they could be, I don't know, sorority sisters, fraternity brothers who want to support the resettlement of a refugee and support them not only in the resettlement, but in the first 30 days financially of their arrival into the country, and certainly much longer than that socially. One of the ways that we can help this program thrive and these communities of care thrive is to be, is to do our work with some acknowledgement and some recognition of the very specific traumas that the queer community deal with. And if you're interested in that, you can read more at welcomecorps.org, or you could reach out to Rainbow Railroad directly at the email address that you see there. In addition to that, just simply staying educated and spreading the word about concerns relevant to the queer community. There's always something going on. And there are always people trying to get at the queer community through, you name it, laws seeking to curtail their mobility, their rights, their access even to the washroom, and as you may know, even reading books to children, right? There's always something going on. Please be aware of it. Please spread the word. And then finally, vote. Like, identify and support officials and policies that affirm the dignity of queer persons worldwide, not only sort of locally, and hold them accountable, right? And these are three very practical and very sort of specific ways in which you can support the work that we do in service to the queer community and their healthcare needs. So here we are.
All right. So any questions, concerns, comments any of you have? No questions?
Marsha, I see your comment. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Dr. Rush Wilson. First, I'd like to say this. I'm going to make sure I wasn't muted. My name's Susanna Mayan. I have a daughter that is a part of the, and I don't want to say this wrong because I'm learning, just the LGBTQIA plus community. And, she shares with me, different things, and, but just hearing, anytime, it's devastating anytime someone is having to flee their homeland because they are in a situation where their livelihood is being threatened. They're, in a situation where they could be, murdered or go to jail for, for their, I'm trying to come out and say what I want to say. I apologize, but it's very sobering just to hear the things that you have said here. I never knew that this, that y'all's organization, existed, and I would like to try to, help out, even if it's a little bit, to help the people that, need y'all's guidance, y'all's assistance, to get out of a dangerous situation so that they can thrive and live their lives, to the fullest, and not have persecution or discrimination for, what their, what their beliefs are. And that's one thing that I've found. I just wanted to ask specifically, when y'all come in or they reach out to y'all, the process, like from the time that they reach out to y'all to like the time when they're able to leave that situation, what generally is the timeline? And typically fund wise, how much does it usually take, like say, you know, for per person to get them out of that situation?
That's a great question. First off, I'll put this into chat. For anyone interested in just getting more information about the organization, please feel free to access the website that I posted there or contact me directly. Susanna, great comments and great questions. I wish there were a tidy answer, and there isn't. And the reason there isn't is because further to Vivian's point, depending on where you are in the world and depending on the kind of political and government context in which you reside, your ability to move simply to, another region of your country, much less another country in the world, it is incredible variation in that. So for example, if someone reached out to us from Jamaica, right, as many people do, it's not so difficult to resettle a person from Jamaica. We first off prioritize based on urgency. If someone is being bullied in school because they happen to be an assumed member of the queer community, yeah, maybe we respond to that at some point. If somebody's being threatened at gunpoint, routinely
Right.
because of who they are, or their house has been burned down, or that's the sort of thing that we prioritize. And so our response time is very much informed kind of by the urgency and the circumstances that they report to us. What is also quite different would be the cost associated with a resettlement or intervention. As I mentioned, in Jamaica, it's easy. It's just a matter of securing a visa if necessary, flying them out of the country. Most places will receive a direct flight from Jamaica. That is not true, for example, of Afghanistan. So in Afghanistan, particularly difficult to do a resettlement because very few countries in the world have direct flights out of Afghanistan. So to resettle a person, and by the way, we have to do it kind of secretively, right, under the Taliban, right? We have to very secretively coordinate ground transfer out of Afghanistan into nearby Pakistan, which is also incredibly dangerous, but just slightly less so than Taliban-controlled Afghanistan. That ground transfer out of Afghanistan into Pakistan itself, and in some cases, we're talking just a matter of a couple dozen miles, right, by ground. The paperwork and the sort of logistics associated with that very simple measure of the intervention is about $3,000 per person, okay? That doesn't even begin to scratch the surface of funds associated with supplying safe housing to this person now in Pakistan, which also has to be done secretively, by the way. Securing the paperwork for their permanent resettlement outside of Pakistan, flying them, then finding housing for them in their resettled country, so that the intervention for a single person out of Afghanistan can cost well over $50,000 easily, kind of thing, right? You multiply this by the number of people who reach out for help, and then the far greater number of people who reach out to help outside of the country, like all around the world. It's an incredibly expensive undertaking. So, this sort of sets the context that suggests, we always need help, right? The partnerships that we enjoy are incredibly important, and the support that we get from donors, again, incredibly important. So I realize I didn't specifically answer your question, Susanna, but I think I get the spirit of what you asked, right?
Thank you very much.
We have time for one more. Is there any other question?
While we finish and wait to see if any other questions, because we do actually have to get into our next session, I just want to answer the question someone asked in the chat about the CEs. Survey link will be emailed within 24 hours of today's program. It'll likely come before 24 hours, but you should get a survey link within 24 hours and instructions on how to download your NBCC clock hours for this session. So. But we do need to close out the session because we do need to get into our next session. So thank you everyone for being here, and thank you presenters for such a wonderful session.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yeah.